Hello, Professor Wiesner-Hanks. I am so pleased to be conducting this interview with you. I have been teaching your book, Women and Gender in Early Modern Europe, for many years through many different editions. And I'm very excited to be teaching again with the fourth edition this fall. And I would like to start out with a question about the book. I noticed it came out back in 1993, previous century. It is now in its fourth edition already. And I'm wondering what prompted you to write the book back when you wrote it, and then also how it has changed through those different editions up to the most recent one.
Sure, happy to talk about that. And first of all, thanks for using it for so long. As an author, authors make some money when they write books. That's not generally your first reason for writing a book, but that's part of it. So I'm glad also that the students have liked it over the years, and that you've found it to be a useful book. So the answer to why I wrote it in the first place is pretty easy. Someone asked me to. Cambridge University Press was coming out with a new series of books that they thought would be useful in classrooms for the kind of things that people teach, that would be designed for students, not so much for those big introductory classes in world history or Europe or Western Civ, but for other kinds of classes. And they asked me if I would be, the editors of this new series asked me if I would be willing to write a book on, as they put it, kind of like women or family or something like that, because these were new fields, relatively new fields it was probably about 1990 when they first asked me. And I thought, yes, I would like to do that. I didn't want to do women and family, because were often, in those days, those were linked together. But women's history and family history are not the same thing. And we kept trying to say this, women's lives are more than family, and the family also involves men and children, and not just women. So they said, well, okay, however you want to do this, the editors of the series said, however you want to do this, that's fine. So as I started to think about what did I want to do with this book, which I had first started as thinking about women in early modern Europe. So for Europe from round about 1450 to round about 1800. But then what was also happening, this is again, about 1990, it was also happening in the 80s, is that people were also first conceptualizing gender as a socially constructed category. And there was enough coming out at that point, and I thought, well, what I really wanted to do was write then a book, which is what it turned into, which is Women and Gender in Early Modern Europe. So when you're writing a book, the first thing that you write is you write a prospectus, which is a thing that says this is what the book's going to be about and what it's going to be like. And that prospectus has to be approved by a board at whatever press is publishing the thing. At Cambridge, those people are called syndics. I love that title, syndics. And the syndics were conservative. They weren't kind of aware of the new things that were going on. And they thought that this sort of, gender, what is that? Nobody really knows what that is. The history at that point was still too new to many of them. And they thought, women's history, maybe I can't imagine that that's going to have any kind of staying power. So there was some pushback from the syndics. The editors of the series, who were wonderful people, said, no, we think this really might sell. This women's history stuff might be around for a while, and we should go ahead with it. So they supported me, and that's what I did. And it went forward, and it got approved. And so I wrote it. And when you write a book like this is really it's a secondary source. In other words, it's a kind of thing the historians write. But it's also really a tertiary source. In other words, it's based on other secondary sources, mostly. Some of my original research, but mostly what other people have written. So that you have to write a book like this based on what's available. And this is, again, in the early 1990s, so sort of the beginning of email and things like that. And what was available, what was known about women and gender in early modern Europe was much greater for, say, England and Italy than it was for Poland or Eastern Europe or things like that. But I had to base what I wrote based on what was available to me and what I could read and languages that I could read. So I tried then to make it as broad geographically as possible, sort of Poland to Portugal, and to cover topics, and it's arranged topically, and has stayed in that same organization all the way, based on what was available and the kind of material that was available to me. I wrote to lots of people. Everybody who I contacted said, hi, I heard you're just doing a dissertation. And this is really new stuff at the point. You're just doing a dissertation on this. Could you share what your findings were? I don't know anything about Jewish women. Could you tell me what about Jewish? How about Poland? And sort of keep harping on Poland. But Eastern Europe was very much, there's not very much, and still not very much about So people were unfailingly gracious with me, sharing their new research, and I tried to make it then as kind of as up to date as possible. Well, despite what the Syndics thought, women's history didn't go away. It was very popular. In fact, it's been the best-selling book in that series. I'll say it, it's been the best-selling book in that series since it was first written. And it ended up being the first book in the series because I meet deadlines. So it was published first in 1993. By 7 or 8 years later, so much more had come out in the field. So I added some things, new material that had come about that. For the third edition, which came out in 2008, I was getting more interested in world history, and we were increasingly thinking about world history just in general in history. And so I decided to add a new chapter to that third edition about women in the colonial world. It's still a book mostly about Europe. It's not about women in the early modern world, all women everywhere, but there's more about women in the colonial world. What happens when you add, if you don't want a book to become giant, is you have to take things away. And by 2008, there was also this thing called the internet, which hadn't existed in 1993. So I moved a lot of things. I moved some bibliography and original sources and things onto an online platform, which we didn't even call an online platform. And I can't remember what we called it, something else. And then this chapter goes at it about colonization and European women and other women in the colonial world. Okay, so for the fourth edition, that's the one, 10 years later, there's a lot more stuff that had come out. So there was, what I tried to do in this fourth edition, the one that you have now, is I tried to sort of thread global issues more clearly through each chapter, not just in this colonial chapter, but also not thinking just about European women that went out into the world, but also people from other parts of the world that are in Europe. So there's been lots of new scholarship as people are interested in Africans who were in Elizabethan England, about slaves in Portugal, about mixed race people moving back and forth from the Spanish colonies to back to Europe. So there are more kind of non-Europeans moving around Europe than we used to think about, and people have done research on them. And about what they've written and about what they thought. And so things have sort of, that's kind of one of the threads that was really new, I think, in the fourth edition. Other things too, I mean, history changes, and what we're interested in history are changing. So other kinds of new kinds of history that have kind of come out in the fourth edition that weren't there in the earlier ones were things about the history of the emotions and the history of the senses. Those are both new threads and new ways of understanding the past. More stuff, I think, about the body in history. More stuff about third genders and trans history, other things. In general, when you write a new edition, you have to update it. You have to kind of look at the range of new scholarship and say, oh, what are people thinking about and doing about now? Some things have to come out. So some issues that back in 1993 were really, people were thinking about intensely. This was a point when history had just gone through what's usually called a linguistic turn, and everybody was worried about discourse. And that was a huge battle. And it seemed really important to talk about that a lot in that edition because it was just a new thing. It's not so new anymore. And it's not so interesting. So some of that kind of things could go out. So some things for what I had to explain in 1993, because in fact I talked about third genders then, nobody had ever heard of them. And I had to explain what they were, and now I don't have to do that anymore. So every edition, there's a whole new range of scholarship to come in. There's new threads that have come in. Students and me, I have different interests, so my interests change, student interests change, and that's what's new in the fourth edition, is this kind of stuff. So thanks again for using it for such a long time.
Really my pleasure, and thanks for this very informative background story to the book. Thank you.